In March 2022, my brother Ronald and I decided to explore a little-known trail near the Cerrado Canyon, a spot famous among local adventurers. About halfway through, already exhausted, we decided to take a shortcut down a steeper path to save time. Shortly after, we realized Ronald's phone had stopped working, even though it had a full charge, and my phone had no signal either. As night fell, we began to hear voices echoing through the canyon, calling our names. The voices sounded eerily similar to those of people we knew, people who knew we were out there, but we were already isolated by that point, and it was impossible for anyone else to be calling us. When we tried to retrace our steps, we discovered that the trail markers we'd left behind had vanished, as if we'd never been there in the first place. I've always loved exploring trails and getting into less frequented spots, but Ronald and I felt completely lost that night. The idea was just to go on a quick hike and take in the view, but from the beginning, the trail was more challenging than expected. The vegetation was thick, and after a few hours, we were already worn out. We thought a shortcut down the steep path would speed things up. We were so focused on saving time that we didn't realize how far we were straying from the original route. At some point, I noticed Ronald's phone had died. He told me it was fully charged, but the screen wouldn't even turn on. I found it odd, but didn't worry too much, figuring I still had my phone. But when I checked the GPS, I noticed my phone wasn't picking up a signal either. It was as if we were in some kind of dead zone. That's when I started feeling uneasy, but Ronald insisted we push on, convinced the exit was close. I trusted him, but that creeping sense that something was off was hard to shake. The feeling of dread only got worse as the sun started to set. By the time it was almost dark, we started hearing voices in the distance. At first, I thought it was another group exploring the canyon, but the voices weren't random. They were calling our names in a way that felt eerily familiar, yet unsettlingly distant. The canyon's echo made the voices even creepier, seeming to come from every direction. Ronald tried shouting back, but no one responded. We felt utterly alone in the middle of the trail, despite the voices. Each passing minute, the voices grew closer, like they were following us, echoing through the canyon walls. It was distressing. At times, it sounded like our mother's voice or that of friends who knew we were there, but it made no sense for anyone to be calling us in that darkness. That weird sense of unease turned into fear. We were in the middle of nowhere, and hearing someone call out to us so clearly was incomprehensible. Ronald tried to keep calm, but I could see on his face he was just as scared as I was. We decided our best bet was to go back the way we'd come, doing our best to ignore the voices. When we tried to retrace our steps, we realized the markers we'd left, small piles of stones and sticks to guide us, had disappeared. It was as if someone had cleared everything. Even our footprints seemed blurred in the dirt, like we'd never walked there at all. It felt impossible. We'd spent hours setting up those markers precisely so we could find our way back. Ronald tried reasoning that maybe someone had walked through and disturbed the markers, but we were far off any main route. It was clear something strange was happening. At this point, Ronald tried to turn on his flashlight, but that, too, was dead. Without any signal and with fear setting in, I started to feel an overwhelming panic building up. The entire forest around us seemed different. The trees, once just thick vegetation, now looked like they were watching us. Every snapped branch or fallen leaf sounded like an approaching footstep. The feeling of being watched was so strong that we froze for a while, afraid any movement would attract whatever was out there. The silence around us was so intense that even the sound of our breathing felt amplified. We stopped speaking, just exchanging glances, trying to understand what was happening. The voices had faded, but a new sense of dread settled in. I started getting chills, as though something unseen was surrounding us, watching every move. The darkness grew thicker, and what had once seemed like an ordinary trail now felt like an impossible maze. Ronald suggested we try climbing a bit to see if we could spot anything familiar, and without much hope, I agreed. Standing still didn't feel like an option. We started climbing, but with each step, it felt like we were drifting further away from any recognizable landmarks. Our feet slipped on loose stones, and the combination of physical exhaustion and fear made everything more overwhelming. Suddenly, we heard a loud sound coming from the opposite direction, like one stone hitting another. We stopped, and in that deep silence, we could swear something was watching us. It was as if we were being followed closely, yet we couldn't see a thing. Then, the voices started up again, but this time they were louder and much closer. They called our names with an unsettling familiarity, like voices we knew well but with a tone that felt completely wrong. A shiver ran down my spine, and I could see the same in Ronald's face. The worst part was that, deep down, something told me to follow those voices, that they would lead us out. But at the same time, some primal instinct screamed at me to run the opposite way. We started moving faster, trying to ignore the voices and the terror that grew with each second. It was like something was testing us, pulling us toward a point of no return. Ronald was ahead of me, and I could see his hands trembling as he held onto a stick for support. Out of nowhere, footsteps began to sync with ours. When we stopped, they stopped too. It felt like we were trapped in a strange game, where every move we made was mirrored by something invisible. I couldn't bear to look back, afraid of what I might see. At that point, I couldn't tell if I was sweating from exhaustion or sheer panic. The voices felt closer, and the worst part was that, at one moment, we swore we heard our own voices calling to us, like reflections of ourselves trapped in that place. The canyon's echo distorted everything, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. Ronald started shouting for help, but all we got back was our own voices, warped, echoing back in a mocking way. It was terrifying. My mind was spinning. I just wanted to get out of there. In one last effort, we pushed forward and finally saw an opening among the trees, a clearing that seemed to lead us out of that stifling part of the trail. But when we approached, the clearing was empty and silent, with no exit, no landmark to orient ourselves by. In the middle of that clearing, time seemed to stop. There was no wind, no sound from the forest, just a void that felt like it was swallowing everything around us. The silence was so deep that it hurt. And for the first time, I felt a new kind of fear, a fear that we might never leave. After a few minutes frozen in that clearing, the silence was suddenly broken by a deep, guttural sound from where we'd just come from. It was a low, drawn-out noise that seemed to be calling us, but without words. Ronald gripped my arm so tightly I could feel his nails digging into my skin. We were in shock, paralyzed, and the sound felt hypnotic, like it wanted us to come closer. But we both knew, deep down, that following it was wrong. Without a word, we agreed with a look and started running the other way. We ran aimlessly, without looking back, just driven by the terror that whatever it was might catch up to us. I could no longer feel my legs from running, and each branch scraping my skin or rock I stumbled over only added to the feeling that we might never escape. Then, out of nowhere, we saw a gravel path that looked vaguely familiar. It wasn't our original route, but for some reason, I felt a sense of relief seeing it. We kept running until we could no longer hear anything, until the canyon was completely behind us. When we finally emerged from that area, still gasping and utterly exhausted, we collapsed on the ground and sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Ronald checked his phone, and it was working again, with a full battery and a strong signal. We looked around, and the canyon seemed like an ordinary place. No voices, no footsteps, nothing at all. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. It's as if we'd crossed into some place where nothing made sense and, for some reason, managed to find our way out. But that fear I felt in that silence has never left me. And I swear, I'll never go back to that trail.